It's one of the biggest questions of the 20th century. How did Germany, literate, educated, cultured, allow itself to be seduced by Hitler? In this episode of the History Book Buffs, we're reading The Nazi Mind by Laurence Rees, which seeks to address that very question. I'm Antonia Senior, and my colleague is Roger Moorhouse, the award-winning historian. Every episode, we're bringing you the books that we love, fact and fiction, new books, old books, all the best books about history. So subscribe, tell your friends, follow us. Help us keep doing the thing that we love best, reading history. So Roger, welcome.
Welcome. We're back again.
We are back again. We're on one of your favourite topics this week.
We are.
One of our mutual friends constantly refers to you as Britain's top Nazi historian.
Yes.
Which makes me laugh every time.
Never fails to raise a giggle.
So just for clarity, we should make it crystal clear that you are a historian of Nazi Germany.
Not
a
Nazi historian. Yes, correct. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, now we've cleared up that potential minefield. We will talk about this week's book, which is The Nazi Mind, 12 Warnings from History by Laurence Rees, a very experienced writer who's written some cracking books over the years. We had kind of mixed feelings about this one, didn't we?
A little bit. I'm a big fan of Laurence Rees generally. He worked for a long time as a TV producer, did some great TV work on this sort of subject, stuff like the Nazis, a warning from history and so on. He's done some great stuff. He must have a sort of reservoir of really good material. And I think he brings a lot of that into his writing now, in terms of sort of interview material and, that sort of thing. So, and research material. So he's got, I imagine, a really good reserve of that, which he's now, in a sense, using to sort of to say fill out his books, but in a positive sense, he's using that material very well. And this one is really interesting, I think, in terms of the approach. It's 12 chapters basically. It first thing to mention is that it achieves a really notable feat of writing, which is to be both thematic and chronological at the same time.
You like doing that in your books, don't you? It's hard to do.
It's hard to do. I did it once, which was in Berlin at War.
Yeah.
And it's pretty hard to do.
But you're doing it with the new one as well, aren't you? Can you remember? It's all a blank. It's got to the stage you've read it so many times.
Yeah, exactly. I've got all the proofs on my desk right now, and I'm going, no, it's not. It's not actually thematic. No, it's chronological. Yeah. So no, I did it very consciously with Berlin, and I think it worked with Berlin. We'll come back to this, whether I think this sort of works on this one. I mean, it's a feat of writing to actually be able to to pull that off well.
And the 12 chapters, each of them, as you say, is both chronological and thematic, but they're chosen specifically to kind of have a modern echo, aren't they? So he chooses them with care, with one eye on the past and one eye on the present.
Yes.
And we're going to come back to that.
We will.
So
the subtitle is 12 Warnings from History.
Yeah.
So yes, there is obviously, or the way it's framed at least, I suppose you could say the way it's bookended almost, is as you say, looking, using the past as a prism through which to view the present.
Right. So we're going to start with a few of the chapters that you think work really well. And that will give people a flavour of what the type of chapters are. So the first one we're looking about is conspiracy theories. That's literally the chapter he opens.
Yeah.
So just to broaden it out for 1 second, the broad overarching theme of the book is, how did the Nazis manage to become so popular? How did that ideology grab people? Why was it persuasive? Why, when it was quite obviously dark, did it actually fill people with kind of...
Did it resonate?
Yeah, why did it resonate?
Yeah.
So this first chapter, conspiracy theories.
Yeah. Yeah, and he starts the book with that. It's a weird thing, you know. Nazi Germany does have a number of very very sort of prevalent and thoroughgoing conspiracy theories, and the one that he starts with, obviously, is the stab in the back from the First World War, which is one of the great sort of Nazi and German right-wing tropes of the early 1920s. You know, the idea that the German military at the end of the First World War had not been defeated in the field, and you know, they'd been stabbed in the back by the socialists and the Jews on the home front and all that sort of, who sued for peace at a point where German forces had not yet been properly defeated, right? And this became one of the sort of main tropes of the German right, and fed into that sort of discontent, because it did come as a shock. The truth of that is that it came as a massive shock to the German home front, that, you know, suddenly they'd been fed this diet, essentially a diet of unending victory, and through much of even 1918, they had been on the front foot with the famous Michael Offensive, for example. So you had this diet through the media of you know, progress, and you know, this is all going very well, and then suddenly it's you know, we're suing for peace. So it kind of looked suspicious, but that's as much to do with the way it was reported as anything. But it became one of the great tropes of the German right, is that, you know, our brave boys at the front, all of that sacrifice was for nothing because our brave boys were betrayed by the socialists and the Jews. Effectively, that was the narrative. And that was a, you know, tremendous kind of support winner and vote winner, you know, for the radical right, not just the Nazi Party, but others on the German right as well. So that's the sort of, if you like, the Ur conspiracy theory, the Ur myth of Nazism. And then obviously, you know, going on from that, you've got, you know, one of the great conspiracy theories, myths that Nazi Germany propagates beyond that, is the idea of some sort of world Jewish conspiracy, which again, as soon as you start to unpack it, you realise how ridiculous it is, because not only is Bolshevism a Jewish creed or inspired by Jews, but capitalism is as well, right? So you've got, once you're into World War II, you've got the Soviets on one side, who are inspired by you know, this Jewish world spider, if you like. And then on the other side, you've got the capitalist Americans, who are also inspired by the Jewish world spider. So you've got this sort of hydra-headed, you know, infinitely morphable conspiracy going on, and that again became one of the you know, central tropes of Nazi propaganda. So, you know, he's right in a way to sort of focus on the idea of these conspiracy theories and these sort of crazy ideas that gained a lot of traction, and fed into the, you know, if you like, dripped poison into the sort of body politic of post-war Germany, or post-First World War Germany. So that's, you know, that's an interesting start. It kind of works quite well as a chapter.
Presumably the contention, the reason it's an echo and a warning from history, is that today's world seems quite prone to conspiracies as well.
Yeah.
And in fact, horribly, the Jewish conspiracy stuff is making a violent comeback at the moment,
exactly,
which is unexpected.
Yeah. I mean, you would have thought we were kind of beyond that, given everything that came after the Nazis, or with the Nazis rather.
But I do wonder whether conspiracies, in order for his contention to work, you would have to accept the fact that conspiracies were more prevalent in the 30s and now than in other time periods. And I don't know whether that's reasonable. Aren't conspiracies part and parcel of being human? Don't we always kind of assume that there are dark forces acting against us, and this is why we don't succeed, not just because it's like bad luck and incompetence on our part or whatever it is, you know? And also, the idea, most conspiracies, it seems to me, are predicated on the idea that somewhere there are people of unbelievable competence who are able to run a conspiracy.
And are pulling strings. Yeah.
You know, we know from our own experience the government can't fix a pothole. So what, you really think they're, you know, involved in some gigantic... What's the one that's doing the rounds at the moment, with the global reset thing, with the George Soros pulling all the strings? And
the chemtrails. So there's chemtrails as well. You know, there's all sorts of crazy stuff. So, yeah, I completely agree. I mean, it's predicated on somebody somewhere being very, very clever, and everyone within the conspiracy is going to keep absolutely stum for all time.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I you know, absolutely 99.9% of the time, it's cock up and not conspiracy in my book.
100%. I mean, if it was possible...
But what he's talking about is you don't have to believe it, but the way that it can have, political currency and gain political currency. That's an interesting chapter. He does a chapter as well on like seducing youth, which again, all totalitarian systems were very good at and put a lot of energy into. Seeing children essentially as kind of the weak link of society, that if you can detach them from their parents to a large extent, if you can take over the education system and turn that to your own devices, at the most extreme ends, turn children against their own parents, that idea of children informing on their parents. You look at the story of Pavlik Morozov in the Soviet Union, for example. So that again works very well. And that chapter sits well. That works. I think that there's a few chapters that work perhaps less well. For example, the one that stuck out to me, because it is, as I said, it is chronological. So he's essentially telling the story of the Third Reich, from beginning to end in this sort of broadly thematic way.
But there is one other chapter you thought, just before we move on to the bits that you think didn't work as well, that you thought worked very well, which was about religion, the faith.
Yeah. So there's an awful lot. I mean, this is an idea that's been sort of battered about for a while in the sort of not only the study of Nazi Germany, but in study of totalitarian systems generally, is that of the sort of quasi and pseudo-religious element. The idea of a God-shaped hole within society that is then sort of filled by whatever totalitarian system it is. And then consequently, you get the regimes take on ever more, apparently religious overtones in a sense, and they sort of mimic religion almost. And in the case of the Third Reich, it's very well expressed. You think of Hitler as a messiah. You can look at Mein Kampf as an Ersatz's Bible in a way. A lot of the ceremonial is very sort of pseudo-religious. Think of the Nazi rallies at Nuremberg, for example, with Hitler on his own up there, sort of preaching and so on. And it is preaching. And the enraptured masses and even stuff like the martyrs. They had the 16 martyrs from the beer hall putsch in 1923 were held up as almost as religious martyrs. It
is extraordinary, isn't it, that it's that sort of the horseshoe of totalitarianism again, that in both of them, communism and Nazism, for movements that were expressly and avowedly atheist, how much they aped the thing that they rejected is just it's astonishing to me that they couldn't, that it wasn't obvious to them, that somebody didn't go, hang on a sec. And to paraphrase the famous sketch, are we the religious nutters?
Yeah, no, it's absolutely right. I think it speaks to the fact that it's a very effective motivator to a large extent. There's the idea of the God-shaped hole. I don't think is kind of a redundant one. I think it's very powerful.
And how far does he then make those links between what's happening now and where is the God-shaped hole being filled now?
Well, that's the thing. I think where the book is less convincing. I think there's some really good material. I said it's well written, or as always, there's really good material. It's very well presented. It's novel, certainly, because he's doing it thematically and chronologically. It allows him to not necessarily be, completely comprehensive in his chronology. So he can pick and choose what he tells you, right? So it allows him to be a little bit pointillist, which works very well, right? So there's lots of really interesting material, well told, well written, where in a sense that structure is just the top and tailing. And that's where I think it sort of falls down a bit, because it's sort of presented. He said it's presented in a sort of in an apolitical way, but it's still resolutely one eye on the present, one eye on the past, and I never think that works terribly well. I mean, there are worse examples of it in other books, but I never think it works particularly well.
It's like we're going to one of those exhibitions at the British Museum where they have all these amazing exhibits, and then the little bump is the curator telling you what you ought to think about it from the framework of whatever the curator is obsessed with.
Yes.
Rather than just telling you about the exhibit, and then you can make the links yourself between past and present, because that's actually the joy. That's like why we love history half the time, is reading about the past on its own terms and making those links ourselves about where it fits into our current worldview.
Yeah. I mean, it's not an egregious example of that. I absolutely take the point. This is not a really bad example of that. It leans in that direction. It's that light, and I say there's a lot of really good material. There's a lot of sort of psychological and, you know, you could even say pseudo-psychological history in there as well. You know, various sort of, you know, this is why people thought in a particular way. This is why they reacted to the regime in this particular way. He brings a lot of that stuff in, which is useful, I think. I think that's quite, you know, you've got to be a little bit careful with that material. But I think he uses it quite deftly. And I think it works quite well. So it's absolutely worth a read. In a sense, it's just the sort of top and tailing that to me I think is redundant. I don't think it needs it. Yeah. And in a sense, the way he's structured it like that, you know, particularly the last chapter is about fear. It's about, I think, sowing fear, I think is the phrase that he uses. But it covers everything from the fall of Stalingrad, or the defeat at Stalingrad, to the end of the war, right? Which is a 2-year period, more than 2 years. And there's an awful lot. There is a lot of fear in there, because what he's saying is that fundamentally this is the fear of the revenge of the Soviets, effectively. So fear is a big theme in the last 2 years of the war, but there's more going on, right? There's more to that narrative than just fear. So I think, in a sense, he sort of boxed himself in to, you know, just telling that one element. Where
it's got to be a lesson as well as a. In
a sense, yeah. So. There's some brilliant material, well written, absolutely worth your time. It's just that structure, to me, it didn't quite do the job for my money.
Yeah. Do you think it edges the? I mean, obviously, you know, you've read loads, so you're not really necessarily the person to ask. But for the casual reader, do you think it would edge them closer to an understanding of the big question of 20th century history, which is why this could happen, why this could take root in a society as, you know, civilized and beautiful and, you know, incredibly admirable and educated
and cultured and all of that.
The German.
Exactly. And that is the great question, in a way, of
it's the big question of the 20th century, isn't it?
Yeah. You know, how, you know, how the land of Goethe became the land of Hitler is that great question. But I think it does, to answer that question. I think it does take you in that direction. Because, I mean, partly because of that, the novelty of the material that he presents, that thematic thing generally does work quite well. The psychological insights, I think, are really useful. So I think it does take you there, yeah.
I mean, there's lots of quite excited chatter at the moment about the 1930s being rerun. And I don't think that it's a bad thing, you know, obviously, bearing in mind our history and the lessons from history. I just wonder whether we become so obsessed with applying World War II lessons to every scenario that sometimes we're kind of misreading events in order to make them fit that narrative. You know, does that make sense? Like, there are so many things going on now that are actually completely not like the 1930s.
Yes.
Completely not like, you know, that particular egregious part of our history.
Yeah.
And the technology is so different, and the way we interact with everybody is so different, that actually it feels to me that sometimes, in order to push those parallels, we're actually missing quite a lot.
Yes. I mean, I think it's like all these things. I think it's a spectrum where, you know, on the one hand, on one extreme, you could have, you know, someone like Trump's envoy to the Kremlin, who doesn't seem to know anything about Russian history or Kremlin history or anything. Like, he doesn't know how they tend to operate and how they string you along and all of that. So he goes into that, you know, completely, you know, as a complete ingenue. and is just bound to be, hung out to dry. So he would do benefit certainly from, a greater knowledge of history. But then at the same time, the other extreme, as you mentioned, is where, we get so obsessed by the parallels and by the echoes, and history doesn't repeat itself, but it can echo, and the echoes sometimes can be quite deafening. But we should also at the same time say, well, it's always different. The circumstances are always different. So yes, it can be an echo, and yes, you can go, oh, that's a bit like it was in 1935. But at the same time, be mindful that, what's going on now in all of its multifarious, variety, as you said, many things are going to be very different, and we have to bear all of that in mind as well. So it is a spectrum. We have to, you can't just imagine it's all a repeat of the 1930s. And this comes back to that, one of the other sort of irritations, and I think you share, is that we only have, particularly in this country, we only have, one point of reference for an evil regime, and it's Nazi Germany. And actually there are others. Other evil regimes are available.
Yes. Although, I also would like to make clear, I think, if we're doing ranking of evil.
Oh, they're right up there.
They're right up. They're right number one. Okay, yeah. We're not going to take away from them. They are literally number one.
Yeah.
But yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
They're not the only thing to fear.
Yeah.
There are other things that are also terrifying.
Yes.
In the quest to understand better then how the lands of Goethe could become the lands of Hitler, do you have other non-fiction books that you would recommend?
Yes. Yes, two spring to mind straight away. The first one, which I've loved ever since I first read it, was Richard Grunberger and his Social History of the Third Reich, which came out, I think, in the early 1970s. And I honestly, I always recommend it all the time. And I'm not sure if it has a sort of wide readership or not. He wasn't an academic. I think he was a school teacher from memory. And I think, again, from memory, I think he was someone who had actually escaped from Germany as a child, as a young man. And it's sort of thematic. So he talks about, the press, he talks about, music, he talks about children, women, and so on. There's 30 chapters. And it shows you how the regime interacted with those particular sectors of society, how the messaging was tailored towards them, how that sector of society reacts. It's brilliantly done, really solid research. And what's lovely about sounds to say lovely about a book like that, but what's lovely about it is that he has a really dry sense of humour. So there's actually laughs to be had in A Social History of the Third Reich by Richard Grunberger. Like, seriously.
Careful now.
No, there really are. I absolutely adore that book. I think it's really good. It's really informative. Okay. And it has this sort of wry eye that I think works really, really well. So that would be one, Richard Grunberger. And the second one, again, another escapee from Nazi Germany was Sebastian Haffner, who, German Jew, came to the UK in 1938, I think. Subsequently, very prominent journalist, worked for The Observer for many years. And he wrote a book called The Meaning of Hitler, which was where he looked, kind of an assessment. I always come back, it's a nice short book, like it's about 100 and something pages. I do like a short book. But really pithy and really punchy and to the point. And he talks about, the character of Hitler. He sort of describes Hitler as a nihilist, as someone who has at his heart, destruction rather than creation. It sounds kind of platitudinous to some extent to say that, but he backs it up, and he backs it up in such an elegant way, and with his own experience at the heart of it as well. So really, really erudite and pithy, and really you feel like you understand both the man Hitler and the regime that he spawned better after reading that book. Really, really good book.
Okay. They both sound fantastic. I would argue that in this case, this is one of those areas where fiction has a huge amount to offer. Because if you're talking about the secrets of the human heart and the ability to lie to oneself and fool oneself and get caught up in an ideology, I think you need fiction. as
Right.
well as fact to understand this. I've got 2 books to recommend. One is the second time I've recommended Walter Kempkowski, and we've only done like 3 episodes
I
of
know.
this. But
Are you on a percentage?
Well, he's dead, but I'm sure maybe his estate can. So he's a German historian and novelist, and he's one of the best German novelists. And he wrote a lightly autobiographical novel called An Ordinary Youth, which basically follows his sort of adolescence in the during the Nazi era. And the thing that's so chilling and so brilliant about it is how he deliberately keeps Nazism off centre stage. He makes it very clear that in his family and in how many millions of other German families, it was a small part of their lives. Their lives just carried on. They lived and they loved and they, and the things that were happening in their name were sort of, not that relevant. The main thing this book would contend that allowed the corruption of the German state in that way was the general indifference to politics, not the enthusiastic, enraptured embrace of it.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember there's a very particularly chilling moment in the book where the boy's mother is lamenting the fact that their Jewish doctor has disappeared, right? And she's lamenting it because he's like the only person who can treat her lumbago. She's not remotely concerned and doesn't connect it in any way, shape or form to the wider politics. She's just irritated because now she has to find another doctor.
Yeah.
And, you could read however many history books as you like, but to come to something like that, I think...
Yeah. And you're right, it's a hard thing to describe in non-fiction. That sort of, it's the absence of something in a sense. Yeah. But I've heard that a lot. And just to finish, to sort of clarify that point as well. I've heard that a lot when I did a lot of interviews with Berlin at War back in the day. And you talk to these people from that generation, and they'd say the same thing. Well, we never talked about politics. My dad wasn't interested in politics. What Hitler brought to the party was we had a job and we had bread on the table. That's how they viewed it, right?
100%.
Obviously not everybody, of course, but a hefty proportion of the German population, said, well, we weren't interested. We didn't pay any attention until it impacted on you.
Yeah.
That you lost a sibling or a father or whatever it was. It was noise, and you didn't pay attention. So there's a danger for us looking back as historians and as commentators. You look back, and we're obsessed with, the ideology and the history and all of that, and you want the protagonists to be as obsessed as you are, and they're just not to a large extent, and that's just human nature. That's how they are. So yeah, I mean, as you say, I think fiction can bring that out much better than non-fiction can.
I think so. And this book's amazing. I really recommend it. My second book is newly out. It's by a French writer called Cécile de Prairie. See how I did all the R's?
That's easy for you to say.
It's called The Propagandist. It's, again, another autobiographical novel, but this is about the other side of the coin. This is about the embrace of Nazi ideology. And the premise of the novel, which, as I said, is autobiographical, is that this woman who is now a historian revisits her past and comes to terms with the fact that her family in France were very enthusiastic Nazi collaborators, not just because it was useful, but because they believed, because they thought it was brilliant. And for me,
and the future,
yeah. and she's wonderful on the sort of sense of limitless, kind of earnest optimism that Nazism offered these young French people who embraced it. And it's chilling, obviously, because the things that they're overlooking in order to find this optimism, or not even overlooking, embracing. So it's really good, and it reminded me very clearly that Nazism, when it left Germany and went out into the wild reaches of Europe, found many followers. It wasn't a uniquely German thing. When Hitler sort of pushed outwards, he found friends. He found people who agreed. He found people who collaborated, and he found people who enthusiastically and helpfully rounded up Jews. And I think this book, very quietly, sort of devastatingly, reminds us of that. There's one scene in it which I found particularly affecting, where the girl's grandmother tells a story about watching the Jews of Paris being round up and deported to the gas chambers, or maybe not to gas chambers, but deported. And an old Jewish man is being held in one of the kind of pens, and he comes to the window and he offers this woman a gold watch in return for a glass of water. Mm. And she takes the watch and she doesn't give him the water.
How?
And I just found that so moving, because obviously, as sort of readers of history and when we're thinking about this stuff, like, one of the questions we always ask ourselves is, how would we have behaved? And, very few of us would have been brave enough to have been counted amongst the righteous. Very few of us. But we would hope that we'd bring a glass of water, right? That we would have
something as small as that.
Something as small as that. And the fact that all over Europe, people would take the gold watch and not give the glass of water, I found devastating when I read it. Really good book. Anyway, really, really chilling.
Brilliant. No, I mean, Nazi Germany is, as we well know, is the gift that keeps on giving to historians and
novelists.
And novelists as well, absolutely.
Although I wish, can I just briefly rant?
Go for it.
I wish that second-rate novelists would stop writing about the Holocaust. I think if you want to write a book about the Holocaust called, the trapeze artist of Auschwitz or whatever it is, I think you should look at yourself in the mirror and say, am I a brilliant novelist?
Am I the bad guy?
Yeah. You should say to yourself, do I have Hilary Mantel levels of wisdom and prose execution? No? Well, then I'm not going to fucking write a book about the Holocaust. I just think they should stop. The idea, I know this is a rant, but it makes me so cross. The idea that the Holocaust can be like a scenic backdrop for a love story, or a scenic backdrop for a murder mystery. It's not a fucking scenic backdrop.
Yeah.
And I'm not even going to edit out my fucks. I'm going to fucking keep them.
You're absolutely right. Keep them in there.
Yeah. No fucks given.
No fucks given. But no, you're absolutely right. And if you're going to do that, and if you're going to do it in that milieu, it's got to be bloody good. And the history's got to be right.
The history's got to be right. But more importantly, to add to it, to add to the narrative, to add to the story, you have to be a brilliant writer of fiction. Otherwise, you're just...
It's just exploitative.
It's just... And there's a separate issue, and we need to bring this to close, but very briefly, there is a separate issue about the fact that as the Holocaust fades out of memory, out of living memory, as the last survivors die, there must be hardly any left, we will be left with a situation where when does it recede into becoming another genocide, and not a specifically terrible genocide that needs to be remembered?
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the reasons why I have a problem with this sort of rash of kind of jaunty novels set during the Holocaust. It's because it implies that actually the almost sacral quality that it has in our historical understanding of the world is being lost. And I'm not sure that that's a good thing. Yeah,
I agree. And the tactical use of the word sacral, Tom Holland will be delighted. On that bombshell, we should probably leave it.
See you next time.
See you next time.